So today I want to talk about dialogue. We had a bit of a request last time to talk about dialogue, and I am always more than happy to talk about whatever's coming up. It actually helps me to to not have to brainstorm and figure out what people might be interested in. So very happy to always take requests. Yeah, so today we are talking about dialogue. And I mean the big purpose of dialogue, we sort of know that we need it in the story. We know that characters don't exist in isolation. They have other people around them, and they're probably going to have to talk to them at some point. But it's not dialogue is not the same as just having a conversation with your grandma or your best friend. And we think that dialogue should be the most natural thing to do. It should be easy to write because we do it all the time, but it's not. And it's another one of those little pieces of fiction where the advice is make it realistic, but not too realistic. So one of the biggest things that dialogue can really do for us, or what we need to be using it for, is to advance the plot. I mean, really, everything that happens is there to advance the plot, and dialogue is really no different. It is a fantastic way to both make the book more interesting to read. It really helps to balance out all of the narration, all of the description, all of the boring big chunks of text. For readers, I think it can often feel a lot easier for them to read when they see usually a relatively short chunk of dialogue that again is balancing out those big chunks. And it also really helps to draw the reader into the story. It helps to put them right there. We are showing them something instead of telling them. And dialogue is one of those fantastic ways to casually drop information, bury information. Last in our last time we got together, we talked about foreshadowing, subplots, recurring elements, and how really, in order to make our conclusions surprising but inevitable, anything that we have that's going to be useful at the climax, we need to show earlier in the story. We need to foreshadow it. But we don't want to make it really obvious how it's going to show up in the end. So we need to find a way to misdirect the reader's attention. We need to find a way to bury it a little bit, make it mean something different, or give it a different purpose for being in the story, so that the reader with their smart little reader brain isn't automatically figuring out what our ending is going to be. So dialogue really does those two things for us. It helps us to advance the plot and drop information in there kind of casually with some misdirection. And it also just makes for a much more enjoyable, much more interesting story that the reader can engage with, that the reader can really connect to. And it's a fantastic way to often show and not tell. Of course, with the caveat there that you don't just put all of your telling information into the dialogue. I think everyone sort of knows that little catch 22. So let's talk about how we can really write good dialogue. What makes good dialogue? And I don't want to spend today talking about the actual grammar and punctuation rules around dialogue. You can go to the internet. I mean, Grammar Girl is fabulous for all of this type of stuff, um, and learn all of that. There's lots of different things that you can do with the dialogue, as far as the punctuation goes. But a little bit outside of the scope of what I was hoping to talk about today, I'm much more interested in how can we, rather than the hard and fast rules, how can we make dialogue and our storytelling that much more enjoyable for the readers? And the biggest thing for me when I set out to write dialogue is I need to know my characters. I need to know my characters inside and out. And that probably seems very obvious, but sometimes we forget about the fact that we're trying to simulate real people having a real conversation. And so we need to know these characters. We need to know their voice. We need to know some of the unique ways that we talk, or that they talk and that we talk. And And it can be very helpful to understand that different people have different patterns of speech, and we can use these different patterns of speech in our dialogue in order to help the reader identify who is talking, as well as give them a more immersive experience. And one of the characters that I've had the most positive feedback over the years is a character that has, a Southern twang, when everyone else has just a pretty sort of basic dialect. Um, and that's written in to the story, or that's written into all of his dialogue, including the way that he says things, including how he might share an idea with someone is filtered through his lens of understanding. It's filtered through what he how he sees the world around him. And so we need to understand who our character is in order to understand how they talk. Um, another fantastic story I read some time ago, um, was a pirate story, um, by Kelly St. Clair, Heba Viva Fair Isles, maybe. And the entire thing is narrated with a pirate accent, and it's written in there. And I remember reading this thing, and I remember the first couple pages being like, this is a bit much. I don't know if I can do it. And by the end of the first book, and then there was a whole series after it, I was so engaged and so immersed, and I was thinking in a pirate accent. So I'd say don't be afraid to give your character a really unique voice, and don't be afraid of having difficulty like sharing that on the page. Um, there's lots of ways to make it come through, and I guess don't be afraid of having it push readers out of the story, because it does make it so much more immersive. Now, that said, you're not going to give everyone a really unique accent and write that on the page every time, because then it starts to maybe be a little bit much. But make sure that every character has that distinct voice, and that you really understand who this character is, where they come from. If they've got an accent, make sure it makes sense for their backstory, um, and ultimately how they view the world. We also want to know about the situation that they're in, right? So dialogue is always going to happen between at least two characters. And what is the nature of that relationship? What is the nature of the interaction? Is it a friendly interaction? They're people that haven't seen each other in a long time, and they are catching up and being surprised by different pieces of news. Um, or are they arguing? Are they enemies? Has someone hidden something from another person and they're trying to hide it while the other person's trying to figure it out? What is the nature of the interaction? As well as for each of those characters that's there, what are their goals? What are their motivations? What is it that they want to make happen in this conversation? What is their emotional state? Are they happy? Are they upset? Are they angry? What is going on underneath the surface? So at the end of the day, first thing with writing really good dialogue is understanding who's involved, knowing the characters, knowing the situation that they're in, and knowing the nature of that interaction, all of the pieces underneath that are going to inform how these characters talk and how they speak to each other, the things that they say, and sometimes more importantly, the things that they don't say. Every conversation that is in your book, every chunk of dialogue really needs to have a reason to be there as well, right? So we look at the situation, we look at, this interaction, this conflict typically between two people, and we always need to be asking ourselves, along with everything else in the book, I mean, what is the point of this being here? What is its purpose? And we're looking for what changes, where are we increasing the tension? it's actually not really good form to have dialogue where you have two people who have been, separated for a year and they reconnect. We don't really want to show the dialogue where they're just hugging and saying, "I'm so happy to see you. Oh, this is so fabulous. Oh, this is so wonderful." Because there isn't a lot of tension there. Now, if they're two people that haven't seen each other in a long time and they've had unexpected changes, someone is trying to hide something from one person, um, all of a sudden you have some tension in there, and it's the things that are being not said that is more interesting than the dialogue itself. So it's always about what changes, where is the tension. And in the same vein, know that you don't need to share everything. You don't need to put every piece of dialogue on the page. So if you've got two characters that are meeting for the first time after being apart for a year, you don't need to write the "Hi, it's so good to see you. How are you?" You don't need to write that all. You can actually summarize it. If it's not interesting, you summarize it and you can kind of tell people what happened. This is that blend of show and tell. So you can sit down and you can say, you can just tell the reader they greeted each other with a hug or however it plays out. Um so again, you don't need to share everything. Not every piece of dialogue that a character says needs to be on the page. So use your judgment about what should be shared and what should not be shared. I think it's also a good thing to be thinking about not just the characters and the story and the tension that's there, but the reader's experience too, right? So dialogue can be used to reveal new information. And this is a two-pronged sort of point. On the one hand, if the reader already knows something, but this character is sharing it for the first time with another character, you don't need to write out the whole explanation from start to finish. You can again put a summary in there and say, "I explain the situation to her," and then carry on with the other character's reaction. We're always looking for streamlined fiction. We're looking to say the most in the fewest words possible. So we don't have to write out something that the reader already knows, even if it's something that changes for another character. We can always just be considering what the characters know already. At the same time, we can use dialogue to reveal new information. We can use dialogue to have a reader come in and accidentally slip up and say something, or for a reader to think one piece of information is not a big deal, but it actually shocks the person that they're talking to, or it's new information for the main character that's coming out in the dialogue. And again, this is something where we don't want to blatantly tell new information. We want to show it, and we can do this through our dialogue, again by focusing on the character voice, the character goals, that character's viewpoint, how they see the world, the nature of this interaction. Are they fighting and someone throws out a piece of information in order to hurt the other person? And all of a sudden, this new piece of information is revealed. Are they randomly talking about something that they did last week? They don't even think that this is an important piece, but it tumbles out, and then the other person latches onto it because it's the big clue that they've been looking for. Lots of ways to do this. Again, it's all about a little bit of misdirection when we're adding other information. What is the reason why this information is being dropped right now? And it's also very useful to leave room for miscommunication, right? Dialogue doesn't really work that well. It's not that interesting if people are answering each other's questions directly, right? Most people don't share everything when they're talking. It's very rare, very unusual to have a very frank face-to-face conversation with someone where you say, um, "What were you doing at so and so's house, and they say, "Oh, I was having an affair," or whatever, right? It's very unusual to have this face to face, very open conversation. So leave room for miscommunication. Leave room for these characters to be trying to hide something the other person they don't want to something that they don't want the other person to know. Leave room for them to be trying to misdirect the conversation themselves so that they aren't being asked an awkward question. um, and and really trust your reader. Readers are smart. They're going to pick up on the cues. They're going to pick up on that subtle shift in body language. Most of our communication is not verbal. It's not really about the words that we're sharing. It's about posture, facial expression, and how a person might move close or further away to someone else. Right? So leave room for all of these things that are going to make your dialogue itself so much more impactful. And of course, the last thing with really good dialogue is making it seamless to read. You know, dialogue has the ability to make a book much more interesting for a reader to read, to balance out, the big chunks of description or narrative writing. So we want to be cognizant that we're making it seamless to read. And again, this whole idea of making it sound natural, but not being a real conversation. And I would advise you, when I write dialogue, you're never going to get it right the first time. Don't put that pressure on yourself. And I often will get right into the flow of dialogue and will just write out exactly what I hear them saying in my head. And I don't add um, any of the dialogue tags or any of the action tags right away. I just write it out. And then I go in and adjust it and fix it. So really what I want to say is follow the flow of dialogue and then do the bit that makes it easier to read. Immerse yourself in the scene and then add on to it so that your reader can also immerse themselves in the scene, because they're never going to see things as clearly as you do in your own imagination. Some real tips for making dialogue seamless is using action tags, using thought tags, in order to, one, reduce the amount of actual dialogue tags, the he said, she said, he asked, she asked. Then you can reduce the number of those dialogue tags. If instead of saying, um, he said hi, he waved hi. We don't need to always, we can use an action to identify who is speaking, which is going to add so much more depth to that conversation, that gives us that nonverbal communication when we're seeing the actions that they do. Also very helpful if you've got, a first person or a third person close point of view, you can add their thoughts in. And it becomes obvious because they're the only one who should be sharing thoughts. It makes it very obvious who's speaking out loud if we also have their inner dialogue in the same paragraph chunk. Because of course we're using one paragraph chunk for each speaker. We don't have the same person talking, or we don't have two different people talking in the one paragraph. Hard and fast rules that we can learn from Google, but very important to follow, because that's actually how your reader can track who is speaking and when. Um, I had another thought there, but it'll come back to me. We also want to be using that subtext. We want to be using the actions, using the little facial expressions, the little mundane actions to imply when characters might be thinking something different than what they're saying. Right? They're wringing their hands, meaning they're a bit uncomfortable. Maybe they're lying. Maybe they're not telling the truth. Um, and again, we trust our readers to be intelligent about this. We also want to be limiting our dialogue tags. That's where those action tags come in. But also know, I think few years ago, a decade ago, maybe, someone came out and said, you don't want to overuse said. You don't want to overuse the word said in your fiction because it doesn't look good if it's he said this, she said that, he said this, she said that. All that repetitiveness is really uh kind of off-putting for the reader. For me, when I read it, it just like pushes me right out and I just like skim down until I find a sentence that looks different than the one before it. Um, but you want to be using said or asked or yelled. You want to be using common words much more so than you're using the words out of the thesaurus. You don't want to be saying, she opined, he expressed. It also takes the reader out. They say that the word said or some of those very common dialogue tasks or dialogue tags are basically readers are blind to them. They don't even see them. They don't even really process it. It doesn't take a lot of work for their brain to figure out what you're trying to say. It's just an automatic lets them know who's talking. So you're actually much better off to use the word said than to use something else more flowery, more literary. It really does throw the reader off. And I think if you watch yourself as you're reading, when you see some of those words, it slows you down because your brain has to process it, and that's not what we want with dialogue. We want our dialogue to be pretty quick and fast. I would also say with dialogue, it's helpful to limit the number of characters in the conversation so that we can be clear about who's talking. And you certainly can have a conversation where there's, you know, 10 people involved, 10 people listening in. But if you think about real life too, very often an exchange is between one or two, maybe three people who are going back and forth. And that makes it a lot easier for you. That makes it a lot easier for the reader. That makes it a lot easier to follow which character is talking, as well as to follow the train of thought that's going on with each character. And I've certainly done it where there's a lot of people in the room, and I've done the telling thing and said, everyone spoke at once, and we had to I had to shout over the din to make myself heard. But then it settles down into, again, one, two, more than one, settles down into two or three people talking. That also allows you to flip back and forth who's speaking without always having to put a dialogue tag on there, because your reader will understand that it's one person and then the other person. We also want to use our dialogue. Dialogue is often very snappy. It's very quick. It really, I think it becomes so engaging because we are going fast. You get to read through it very fast. And so it sparks a little bit of, I don't quite know the word. It sparks a little bit of excitement, a little bit of anticipation in you when you're reading that fast. And so another point to make is that I often limit my dialogue to one or two sentences for each person as they're speaking. You don't want to drop the 3-paragraph soliloquy in the middle of your novel, because it really slows down the reading and can push a reader out just because it's more challenging to read. It's not easy and fast to read, and it doesn't hold the attention as well. And if we think about a real world conversation too, we think about something other than this where I'm just speaking to you continuously. If there was a couple of us face to face having a conversation, we would really only use 1 to 2 sentences at a time. It's very rare that people want to stand on their soapbox and go for 5 minutes straight, right? And people usually talk fast. They usually are going to They're usually going to use contractions. They're usually going to probably drop a couple of words from their sentence. And they're probably going to cut each other off too. It's probably going to be this very quick back and forth. And that's something that we want to bring into our dialogue. Again, with a little bit of an eye to not making it totally understandable, or a little bit of an eye to making sure that it's still understandable and not ununderstandable. Um, uh, and again, just focus on this really kind of fast back and forth. And the same with our action tags. We don't want a character, unless we need that conversation to slow down. We don't want a character to take 3 paragraphs worth of action before the conversation resumes. We want to stay in the flow of the conversation as much as possible. Couple other tips: avoid using names. Very rare in regular conversation that we would use a name, and so we don't need to use it in our fictional conversations. Again, unless, of course, we are using it for a certain type of impact. We're using it to show a character's emotional state where they say, "George, I'm so angry." Use your judgment there, right? Um, and again, don't worry about the complete sentence structure. And that's really my top tips for dialogue. It's the same as everything else in fiction. It's, knowing your characters, knowing the situation, knowing the emotions that are going on and the different points of view and the different goals or motivations, the things that they're working towards, and how all of that interacts, how that's going to create tension, what's going to change for the story. What is the point of this dialogue? What is the point of this conversation being here? And I love dialogue. It's so good. It's so important to use for showing all of these different things, like character interactions, like burying information we're going to need later. But if there's no point, if nothing changes, we can summarize that dialogue into one sentence where we tell the reader what happened and move on to the next thing, because we need to keep that tension high. We need to keep the interest high. And then, of course, lots of little tips and tricks that we can use to make it seamless to read, including, alternating dialogue tags with action tags, with thoughts that are shared by the point of view character, and making sure that we're varying the structure of that. So it's not always he said this, she did that, he said this, but we're putting the tags sometimes in front, sometimes behind, and using, again, different types of tags. And then just a couple tips and tricks to make your dialogue a little bit snappier. Short, relatively short sentences, you want really short paragraphs here so that there is a back and forth, and avoiding using names, using some of the ums and ahs, really shortening those sentences, to be in line with how regular people would talk to each other, with, again, contractions and incomplete sentences. So that is everything that I wanted to say about dialogue, and I very much hope that it helps as you're going forward and writing your story. Don't be afraid to write your dialogue in layers. Don't be afraid to write out what people are saying, then write out what people are doing, and then adjust it to make it seamless. We always, until something is published and out in the world, we always have the ability to adjust it and make it more engaging to read.